This evening, allow yourself to be swept away to a mystical earth where all of the magical creatures of fairy tales come to life. Tonight's story is an extract from The Moon Princess, written by Edith Harrison. I'll be your narrator, Carissa Vacker, and this tale is The Valley of the Fairies. They were most reluctant to leave the beautiful world under the water, but the Sun Prince and the Moon Princess must keep their engagements, and there were many journeyings for them yet. The Ocean King had kept them as long as possible in his dominions, but now he felt obliged to let them go, and so, regretfully, bade them adieu. He had arranged in their travels about his strange and wonderful possessions to land them in a beautiful southern country. From this spot, they would travel north towards the Valley of Enchantment to visit the Sun Princess, that lovely sister of Prince Dorian, who was making her home in this world. They all looked forward with much pleasure to this visit. It seemed, in fact, to be one of their chief topics of conversation, for they naturally desired to see the only sister of Prince Dorian, who was famous for her great beauty. Reluctantly, the company bade adieu to the Ocean King and his charming family and rose through the clear, limpid waters of a big gulf. It was a beautiful sight that met their eyes as they came to the surface in the open sunlight. A wonderful land lay before them. Its shores were shaded with spreading branches of magnificent live oak trees, which grew down to the water's edge, planting their splendid trunks in the very midst of the curving line of yellow sand. Farther back, pink crepe myrtles, yellow acacias, and white Spanish daggers were scattered, and a long row of pecan trees kept dozens of chattering squirrels busy. Cherokee roses bloomed in thousands, their yellow hearts showing in brilliant contrast to their dazzling white petals. "How beautiful this country is," said the princess, and everyone echoed her words. As they landed, they were greeted by the Sun Princess's messenger, who would guide them northward to the Valley of Enchantment. This guide belonged to the company of the Sun People, who had accompanied the Sun Princess to her new home. He proved a charming companion indeed, for he knew everything about the countries through which they passed, and in their travels told them many interesting facts. They learned that they were in a southern land on the borders of a great gulf. They could see, beside the live oaks, some superb trees growing to great heights. Trees with great, long, green leaves, holding big, creamy blossoms that opened like white chalices to catch the sun. One tree especially stood out in magnificent strength. Its rough old trunk was enormous and knotted with age, and its broad branches spread out, protectively covered with big waxen leaves. The great tree had a dignity about it that fascinated the princess. As the little company walked nearer to examine it, they noticed how the grass, soft as velvet, stretched away like a green carpet toward the yellow marsh beyond. The nearer they came to the tree, the bigger the tree looked, and they found a round hollow in one side of the trunk where a squirrel had hidden his nuts. "It is a magnolia tree," the guide replied in answer to their questions, "and there are many thousands like it scattered through this southern country." At that moment, a sound rose upon the air, so soft and exquisite in its melody that they held their breath to listen. It came from the branches of the tree and was a song of welcome from the mockingbirds. In a moment, 1,000 of these little feathered songsters had joined the chorus. Their notes rang out joyously, for they warbled and trilled in an ecstasy of delight until the strangers thought they had never heard a more beautiful concert. Then, suddenly, while the Moon Princess listened entranced, the music ceased as abruptly as it had begun. They heard a flutter of soft wings and saw above their heads a flock of tiny birds. The birds were lovely, a soft gray in color, with a splash of white on the wings and tail, and as they flew away and disappeared in the distance, all became silent again. What a silence it was! Not a sound broke the stillness. The brilliant sunshine danced along the ground like little sparks of fire, but not a leaf stirred. It grew warm. The blue gulf lay like a sheet of glass in a sort of golden mist. The heat was intense. It seemed to shimmer in a yellow haze over everything. And then suddenly, a little movement broke the profound stillness. It came from the green-eyed, red-throated lizards as they ran through the grass. They stopped to watch the strangers wonderingly, but as the Moon Princess moved slightly, the timid little creatures took the color of the leaf on which they were and lay motionless. Then the princess spoke softly. "This world is very wonderful. I have never seen so many bewildering things before." As they resumed their journey, the guide told them the history of the bird. "The mockingbird is really the southern fairy, you know," he began, "and the entrancing song it sings is only the story of its life. It tells the tale over and over again in a delicious burst of song, as the little children alone understand the fairies' speech. I cannot tell all it says, but I will repeat exactly what I have heard. Once upon a time, there dwelt in the midst of that great magnolia grove we have just left a band of fairies. They were the lightest hearted and happiest little band in the world, and they had just celebrated a splendid marriage. One of their most beautiful princesses had married a nephew of the queen. He was as handsome as his bride was beautiful, and everything went merry as a marriage bell. Now Prince Addleston, in spite of his high rank and station, was always playing some prank upon someone, but his tricks were generally good-natured, and the fairies seemed to love him the better for his fun. He was, indeed, a great favorite with them all. Now, when he married the dignified and beautiful Princess Verdanda, everyone predicted that he would become more sober and, as a married man, put aside his boyish manners. It really seemed just about as they prophesied. Of course, a fairy's life is a brilliant round of pleasure, but Prince Addleston seemed contented to travel the world over with his lovely wife and act just as all well-behaved fairies should. The little people were all delighted, of course, with the change in their favorite, and said among themselves he was even more attractive than ever. In reality, Prince Addleston was so absorbed in a plan he was forming for himself and his bride that he had no time to think of playing foolish pranks on others. Fairies, as you know, are free to do exactly as they please, except for one rule, and that rule can never be broken. Their life must be lived at night, amid moonshine and starlight, and then they pass many gladsome hours together. From dusk until dawn, they are the merriest little people in the world. But at the first streak of light, every fairy must vanish under a leaf, in the heart of a rose, behind a dewdrop. The fairy may hide, but hide he must, and there remain sleeping until darkness again falls upon the world. This rule in fairyland has been enforced for centuries, and no one, however brave, has had the hardihood to break it. Sometimes, but very rarely, on a day when the sun does not shine and the earth is covered with a white veil of mist, a fairy can peep out, but he must be extremely careful that he is only in the mist, for he must never see a ray of sunshine for a moment. Well, can you imagine what Prince Addleston decided to do? He determined upon a terribly rash thing and planned it for months. He lay awake thinking of it, for in his excitement he could not sleep. He whispered it at last to his beautiful bride, who trembled in his arms as she listened. She was horrified at first and pleaded with him to give up his rash plan. But he was bent upon it, and after weeks of pleading from him, she finally yielded and consented to help him. Together, they decided to elude the fairies and break the law, for their rash determination was no less than this: to see the sunrise. Night after night they discussed it, and one beautiful moonlight, when they had danced until dawn, and the other fairies, exhausted, had slipped into the hearts of the magnolia blossoms to sleep, Prince Addleston and Princess Verdanda stole carefully down to the waters of the gulf and, breathless with curiosity, awaited the coming of the sun. Never shall they forget that morning. The waters of the gulf looked steely gray in the first faint light of dawn. A pearly white mist was lifting slowly from them and melting as it lifted. The little bride caught her breath with admiration as the cold steel gray of the water slowly changed into a delicate, warm pink, for the gulf, like a great mirror, was reflecting all the lights in the sky. The seashell pink of the faint dawn heralded the approach of the sun. Gradually, the delicate coloring grew a deeper rose until the white clouds overhead seemed dyed in crimson. The waters lay still and silent. Hardly a ripple disturbed their serenity. Presently, long, piercing rays crept across the sky, while all the colors of the rainbow seemed to blend and mix together. Gradually, the world grew brighter and brighter. Then suddenly, out of the shining water rose a great red ball of fire. The princess clung to her husband, for, beautiful as it was, she was surprised and frightened. The sun mounted slowly into the sky, casting his brilliant rays across the heavens, and at the same time, great slanting streaks of yellow beams danced before their bewildered eyes. The waters of the gulf were marvelous to see, for they glistened like millions of flashing diamonds. The two fairies stood, amazed at the magnificent sight before them, for even fairyland has nothing more beautiful than the sunrise. Presently, a flock of white seagulls rose shrieking from the sands, and Prince Addleston and his wife, startled by the sudden noise and abashed by their terrible disobedience, tried to hide behind a blade of grass. Alas, what was their horror to discover that they could not. They had grown much larger, and they realized in despair that they could no longer hide under the flowers. Their wings, too, had disappeared, and they knew they were banished from fairyland. Then their sorrow began, for, try as they did, they could find no trace of their brother and sister fairies. There was a dreamy stillness everywhere, and the flowers were very tempting in the early morning dew. But alas, those flowers no longer formed a home for the disobedient fairies. Hand in hand they wandered, and for miles they stumbled sadly along until at last they reached the edge of a great marsh. The green and yellow grasses there were scarcely moving, and lovely tints were shimmering in a hazy amber splendor. The unruffled waters of the bayou, as it ran curling around the rushes, gleamed in spots of silver. The world took on new beauties beneath the sun, but the unhappy princess and her husband could not enjoy them. They journeyed about in misery until they found the gnarled old magnolia tree. They hid themselves in its hollow trunk. The fairies, of course, had missed them and knew perfectly well of their misfortunes, but the queen's heart was hardened against them because of their dreadful disobedience. However, the band of little fairies, in spite of all, united in deep sympathy for their erring brother and sister, and they prayed the queen to grant them pardon. The queen's heart softened a little at last, for after all, the prince was a beloved nephew. But even she had not full power to restore them to fairyland. The law once broken, full penance must be done, for disobedience is a dreadful crime in fairyland. Late one night, when the moon was high in the blue sky and the world was flooded with silver, when the bright stars flashed out like millions of dancing points of fire, the two unhappy culprits crept out from the hollow of the magnolia tree. The fairies were holding high festival, feasting on rose leaves and drinking the dew from tiny acorn cups. Thousands of them were dancing in and out of the moonlight, and their bright wings flashed gold and silver lights wherever they moved. Their wands, too, sparkled and glittered as if they were on fire. The exiled prince and princess gazed sadly upon it all, seeing now fully what they had lost. But alas, it was too late. They knew quite well their bulky forms without wings could never again become as light and airy as before their disobedience. Swiftly, however, they ran forward, and before the astonished queen had time to escape, they threw themselves at her feet, begging for pardon. The queen frowned as she listened to the story of their disobedience, and the other fairies shuddered when they heard of the great crime. Still, Her Majesty loved her nephew and his bride, and her heart was heavy as she heard the sad tale. The queen was unusually handsome that night, and seated on a throne of moss rosebuds, she seemed very far above the culprits at her feet. Her white and silver dress sparkled brilliantly against the bright pink of the rosebuds, and the green leaves about them were so covered with dew that they seemed to be made of frosted silver. Alas, my dear children, she began sadly, I have not the power to make you fairies again. You have lost fairyland forever by your act of disobedience. Once banished, you cannot be recalled. Beside, were it possible for me to admit you again to fairyland, you would never be happy with us again. You have seen the glorious sunrise once, and nothing in fairyland is so beautiful. You would constantly long for that magnificent sight again. But, she added thoughtfully, perhaps I can render you perfectly happy in some other form upon the earth, and in this way restore your contentment. Tremblingly, Prince Athelstan and his bride bade her change them, for, miserable as they were, they knew she spoke the truth. They would never be happy in fairyland again. They would always long to see the sunrise. Then silence fell upon them all as the queen slowly raised her glittering wand. Presently, there arose upon the stillness of the night a most glorious sound. It was the mockingbird raising its voice in thanksgiving and praise for happiness found again. Again and again, those delicious sounds floated out on the air, filling the night with sweetness until the very fairies stood breathless to listen. It seemed marvelous that so much sweetness of sound could be contained in such a tiny body. But the little songsters trilled and sang in glorious delight. Only in this land of sunshine and magnolias will you find this wonderful bird. It never wanders far from the Gulf. It flourishes best amid the magnolias, and it fills the southern woods with music. It sings at all hours, at night when the moon is looking kindly down upon the earth, and the earth is serenely smiling to the moon. Its clear notes ring out joyously until even the stars from their glittering palaces lean down to listen. But it is at the witching hour of dawn that the most wonderful of its melodies is heard. Then it awakens to watch again that miracle of the world, the mystery of the rising sun. And as the golden spears of light streak the heavens, cutting away the white veil of mist and coloring the skies with rainbow hues, its glorious voice rings out and floods the world with music. For at that hour, the mockingbird is telling over and over again the story of that magnificent sight, the sunrise.